Okay, well, we are live. I'd like to go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Jenny, and I'm here on behalf of BMA Atlanta. We are a business-to-business marketing association. This is our Hangout on Air Continue the Conversation series. It's our version of a webinar. I'd love for you to check out our website, bmaatlanta.org, and follow us on Twitter at BMA Atlanta. Today, we're bringing you Marc Dorfman, and we're going to learn a little bit about structuring a persuasive business presentation. We're very privileged to have Marc back with us. He was our speaker at last month's YP Young Professional event, and we're very fortunate to have him share his expertise with us. So, Marc, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I've been in the communication skills training arena for about 8 years. Before I came to Atlanta, I worked at Columbia University. I was the communication skills specialist at Columbia Business School and a professor at NYU Stern Business School. And before that, I worked in the film business in Los Angeles. And so I was on the producing side. And a lot of people will ask me, so Marc, how do you go from feature filmmaking to talking about business presentations? And what I say is, they're very similar. Both have an audience, a script, and actors. The only difference is with the presentation, you get to ask the actors questions. But both are very similar. Both rely on good stories. And so that's a little about my background.
Wonderful. And when I had approached you about doing this and I asked you what you thought would be a really good topic to talk on, tell me a little bit why you chose this one.
Well, I chose talking about organizing a business presentation because a lot of people, when I'm training, when I'm coaching, that's the first thing that they have questions about is, I don't really know how to organize my information, I don't know how to start, I don't know how to put something in the middle, and I don't know how to end. So I thought, well, maybe in the half hour that we have, I could give some tips for helping people organize and at least get them off to a good start with a structure that they can use.
Ooh, I love that. I feel like people know the meat of what they want to say. A lot of times they know their content like the back of their hand, but structuring it and presenting it and packaging it up is something completely different, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Most people have lots and lots of information, especially if it's technical in nature. And then the question is, what do we do with all this stuff?
Ooh, that's good. Okay, well, I would love you just to go ahead and start sharing with us about it, and just know that I might jump in here or there to ask a question or to comment, as I like to keep this conversational. But yeah, I'd love for you to get started.
Great. So the first thing that I suggest people do is they understand what it is that is on the mind of their audience. So what is the most important thing that the people you're going to be speaking to have on their mind? And if we don't know this, then we're in trouble, because then we're not exactly sure what it is we should be talking about. So the main thing is understanding your audience. What is the main problem that's on their mind as it relates to what you're speaking about? So that's where we start.
Can I ask you a quick question about that? Do you envision this as internal, so in-house professionals are giving a presentation to their peers or the people within their company, or is it someone who's doing a speaking presentation, or both?
I think it's both. In other words, your audience is there to get some information. You're there to potentially move them to take some action. Whether it's an internal or an external audience doesn't really matter, other than how well they may know the subject matter. If it's an internal audience, chances are they're a little bit closer to what you're speaking about, but oftentimes they're not. People are speaking to another department, another division, people who work elsewhere. So whether it's an internal audience or an external audience, the dynamics are basically the same.
Gotcha. And are you thinking that this is like a formal presentation, like someone has a PowerPoint behind them, or is it just an off-the-cuff addressing, putting something out at a meeting, or is it everything?
For the most part, it can be any type of persuasive presentation, and I just want to mention that most presentations run the spectrum from informative to persuasive, and there is a difference. For a lot of people, when they're presenting, their goal is to just inform, make people aware of something. But I'm talking about something different. I'm talking about presentations where there's actually a call to action, where as a result of what it is that you're saying, you want people to do something. There's a next step that's definable, and hopefully it's measurable as well.
Oh, gotcha. So this could be to a potential client or presenting a proposal. Like you said, it could be internal, it could be speaking to a group, or it could be something like that, presenting to a client.
Yes. So, for example, I do a lot of work with startup companies that are pitching for venture capital. So that's one scenario. Another scenario might be you're a consultant and you have a recommendation and you want people to implement your recommendation. So it can be any type of business situation where you want people to take some sort of action as a result of what it is you're saying.
Gotcha. Okay, perfect. Thank you. I just wanted to lay the groundwork. There's so many different types of ways I think people can utilize this information. So I just wanted to set up if it was a specific, very formal PowerPoint, or if it could just be a conversation. But like you said, there's an action behind it. You want to persuade someone to do something. So.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So yeah, please continue.
So once we know, and then the question is, how do we know what is on the mind of people in the audience? And my suggestion is that you need to find out. Guessing is not a good solution, because if you guess and you're wrong, then your presentation may fall flat. So I always recommend to people that, if you're presenting in front of a group, no matter how large or how small, find out from somebody, perhaps the person that's invited you to speak, what it is that they want you to talk about. So this is key. This is, again, the most important first step. And then once you have that, then you have a means by which to actually begin your presentation. So for a lot of people, they don't know how to start. And what I suggest is you start by actually addressing what is on the mind of your audience directly. And the way that we do that, or the way that I suggest people do that, is by actually saying, I understand, and then fill in the blanks for whatever it is that is the problem on the mind of your audience. So I don't know if is that clear? Does that make sense?
It absolutely does to me, because I started out as a copywriter, and the very first thing that we are trained to do when you write copy is to put yourself in the environment. Like, what is the person who you're talking to, what does their world look like right now? And you want them to be able to self-identify and to get on the same level with your target who you're talking to. So for me, that makes perfect sense, but it's different than I've ever heard to. Generally, people just start talking. They don't put themselves out there, and they just don't put it out there like that. So that's interesting.
Yeah, so, there's an acronym that I use, and I tell people to take AIM, A-I-M. And that means the first thing you think about is your audience. That's the A. The second thing you think about is your intent. So what is it that you want? And then you start crafting the message. The mistake a lot of people make with presenting is they start off talking about themselves. They start off talking about what they're there to do. They talk about their company, their background, a whole list of credentials. And what I'm suggesting is you do the opposite. You start off by addressing what is on the mind of the people in your audience.
I love that. Very smart. It seems so common sense, but nobody does it.
No, it's very, very rare, and that's one of the reasons why so many people dread listening to a presentation, because a lot of times people who are presenting are much more focused on what they want than what the audience can benefit from.
I agree, and I've got to tell you, it's one of my biggest pet peeves when half of the content is hearing all about the person and their background and their bio and their credentials before we ever get to anything good. It's annoying. It annoys me in any type of setting. So I do really like how you talk about them first because it's what's in it for me, and then you can certainly get into that, but relaying it in context, correct?
Yes, so normally if I'm presenting, I won't talk about myself really until I get into the meat and potatoes of the presentation, unless somebody's introducing me. But I don't worry too much about me. My first objective is address the need of the audience. And how do we do that? Well, there's a couple of ways to do that. My suggestion is we start with some sort of a story. Some sort of a story that illustrates what the problem is. So, for example, if I worked with a few years back and they were introducing a new type of software system that was going to make people's lives easier. There was a lot of data input. And so the way we started that presentation is by talking about a day in the life of Bob. You know, what would Bob normally do, and all the problems that Bob encountered along the way using the current type of software system. So this way, people can relate to what Bob is going through, and they can understand the problem. So I always recommend starting with some sort of a story to capture your audience's attention and to engage them.
I love that, and I would love to hear some of your best storytelling tips, because at least I know for me, but for many people, I feel like some people are very natural storytellers, but others have no idea how to even tell a good story. Do you help people through that?
Absolutely. A lot of people have all this information in their head, but as you mentioned, they're not trained in crafting a story. And if we think about stories and think about the stories that we learned in our childhood, they typically start with a lot of detail around who, what, when, and where. You know, once upon a time in a land far away, there was a princess and there was an evil dragon. You know, so when it comes to crafting a story, we begin by setting the scene. Who, what, when, where. And then, once we do that, we want to take people on a journey. And so if you're not sure about how to take people on a journey, well, what I recommend is think about an experience that you or someone else has had related to the problem that you're trying to solve. So I don't know if that makes sense, but if whatever is on the audience's mind, for example, come up with a story that relates to what it is that they're thinking. And a story should have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And an end is usually the solution to the problem.
Gotcha. And tell me again, because I'm seeing so many similarities between writing copy, persuasive copy. There's a difference between informative article writing and writing copy that's intended to persuade. And so one of the things that you don't want to do a lot, but you definitely want to make the pain points evident. Is that part of what a story and storytelling does, is that you not exacerbate, and you certainly wouldn't want to exaggerate the problem, but you do want to really put it out there where here is the pain point that this solution is going to ultimately address. But is that something the story helps do too, is put the problem out there on the table and make it visual for someone?
Yes. I mean, stories, just like you said, when it comes to journalism and writing stories, stories are the oldest form of communication that we have. I mean, long before there was the internet, people were telling stories by making pictures on cave walls. So we're actually programmed to enjoy stories, to understand stories, and to remember stories. And so, yes, to your point, one of the things that a good story should do is raise the pain points by example. You know, so what I mentioned, my example was a new type of software. The pain points that were raised in the story related to all the problems that people who are using the current software are experiencing. And so for people in the audience, they can see themselves going through that process and running into all of these problems. And so there's immediate sense of relatability.
Gotcha. That makes sense. So I know that you have other things to talk about, but just really quickly, do you have any tips to give us on when storytelling falls flat or when it's a big fat failure?
Yeah, sometimes storytelling falls flat if you're not making a good point. Sort of like a joke. I mean, if a joke isn't funny, well, then it isn't funny. A story should set the stage. So I'll give you a good example. I once worked with a group of people who had a business idea for people who would fix appliances in third world countries, and they were focused specifically on parts of India. And the way that they began their story is one of the women in the group talking about what happened when a bottle of wine spilled all over a tablecloth the night before a big formal event, and all the problems that they went through trying to find somebody who could fix the washing machine so they could clean the tablecloth. And in the end, they weren't able to find anyone who could fix the washing machine to clean the tablecloth, and so the problem then was evident. We need people to help fix appliances in third world countries.
Gotcha. Okay, good. Well, thank you. Well, okay, so please continue more about going back on track. I took us off track a little bit with the storytelling, but with the structure of it. So like you said, it's the aim, the audience, the intent,
and then the message.
And then the message. Okay, perfect. So then what comes next?
So the first thing we do is we start by telling a story that addresses the audience's concerns. And then what we do is we throw in an if-then statement. And the if-then statement is a one-sentence overview that basically says, if you do what I suggest, then you get what you want. So for example, if I was, let's say, doing a presentation where I was pitching to venture capitalists trying to raise money, then I might say, if you invest in my product or service, then you will get some type of financial return. So it's a very simple process. First you introduce the problem, then you throw in an if-then statement that basically says, here's what I want you to do, and here's the result for you if you do what I suggest.
Oh, I've never heard that. Is that supposed to be intended to be a very bold, confident statement to catch attention, or is it just a very matter-of-fact statement, or both?
It's both. It's both. And one of the reasons that we structure presentations this way is because for a lot of people listening, they don't really understand what it is that the presenter wants, and they don't necessarily understand what the benefit is to them if it's not presented clearly and presented up front. So, if you watch the presentation that we're doing now, then you'll learn some tips for structuring a presentation. So it's if-then, and it's very simple, it's very direct.
Oh, I love that. So instead of waiting till the very end to deliver and here's the final thing or here's the wow statement, you just very simply put it at the front, and then you could recap it at the end, but just instead of waiting till the end as okay, here's what you just learned, you put it at the beginning, which I don't know if I've ever heard anyone do that.
Yeah, it doesn't happen very often, but it's very powerful. Again, what we're trying to do is make sure that the people in the audience know that we're there to help them and we're addressing their concerns. And so by giving this if-then statement up front, we're basically giving them sort of a roadmap that, if you go from point A to point B, here's the benefit to you.
Gotcha. And let me ask, is this something proprietary where you came up with this structure based on your history and your background and what you know works, or is this like written in some book that nobody knows to do. I mean, is this your stuff, or is this the common knowledge out there?
Well, this is definitely not common knowledge, and it's definitely not just coming from me. So one of the things that I do is I'm an executive coach at a company in Atlanta called SpeechWorks. And a lot of this comes from the work that I've done with SpeechWorks. So, but definitely, I mean, people take a lot of this information and they spin it in different ways. But I don't know if any of this is necessarily my own genius. It's just the way that I've decided to package it.
Right. And it's the way that you've seen is successful.
Yes, it's very successful because it helps people know how to start, know how to grab attention, and then it helps people lead the audience on a journey.
Okay, I love that. Okay, so please continue then with what's next after the if-then statement.
Yeah, so once we have our if-then statement, then what we want to do is we want to come up with the 3 points that we think the audience needs to remember if they're going to be persuaded of our message. So what are the 3 things that we think the audience needs to know if we're going to persuade them? And the reason that we use the number 3 and not the number 1 or the number 5 or 12 is, number 1, people tend to remember not much information. So even if we had 100 things that we thought were very important, at the end of the day, chances are they'd only remember 2 or 3 anyway. The other reason that I say 3 is because 3 is a way that in Western society we tend to chunk and remember information. So we have first, second, and third place, small, medium, and large. Gold medal, silver medal, bronze medal, beginning, middles, and ends. So we tend to chunk and remember things in 3s.
Gotcha. But do people always groan when you tell them that they have to stick within the 3? Because I think you're right. Most people, they think the more the better, and they want to give lots of supporting reasons. So when you say you've got 3 things and that's it, they must be like, oh, come on, Mark. Is that true, or is it actually a sense of relief to people?
It's both. I mean, for people who are in a technical field, they're so used to persuading people through data and information, and they're used to sort of downloading information, almost like, if our brains were hard drives, they'd like to take everything that's in their head, put it on a USB drive, and then stick it into the heads of people in the audience to download data. But we're not computers. We don't learn and we don't remember this way. And so the challenge then is for the presenter to boil down their information into 3 key points. Now they can expand on these points and they can have subsections underneath these 3 points. But my suggestion is if you can't boil it down into 3, then you haven't done your homework, because then what you're going to do is you're going to overwhelm your audience, you're going to overload your audience, and they're not going to remember.
Oh, and does that apply if it's a 30-minute presentation versus a 3-hour presentation?
Yes, it applies. So, the difference between, let's say, a 30-minute presentation and a 3-hour presentation, heaven forbid if we have to present for 3 hours, is that what we probably do is we'd have more information to present, but we would just chunk it under our 3 main points. Now, is this always going to work for every single presentation? Probably not. But it probably works for about 75 to 80% of them. And that's not bad as a working first way to start.
Gotcha. Okay, wonderful. And I just wanted to give a heads up that we're at the 5-minute mark. But please go ahead and continue.
Yeah, so we have the very first thing we do, I'm just going to recap, is that we grab our audience's attention by talking about the problem that's most important to them. Then we have an if-then statement that tells them, if you do what I say, then you get what you want. Then we have the 3 most important things that our audience needs to remember if they're going to be persuaded. Then what we have is a recap. where we restate our if-then statement and our 3 key points, and then we close with a wrap. And in a persuasive presentation, that wrap is a call to action. It's what is it that we want the audience to do? What are the next steps that we want them to take in order for us to get what we want and in order for them to get what they want?
And so I don't know if this applies, maybe it does, but what I've seen and what I've heard is that most presenters or most people when they're speaking, they spend all their time on their content, and then at the end they're like, okay, great, thank you, here's my website. Or do you think that people don't spend enough time on the closing and repeating the action and reinforcing, or do people really just need like a minute?
I think for a lot of people, they assume that the audience knows what it is that they want, and they either on purpose or just forget to actually ask for something. You know, and this applies to not just a presentation, but even an email. You know, you want something. If you don't ask for it, you can't expect the audience or your reader to know what it is that you want. So you need to be very clear, and the clearer you are, the better it is for you. In addition, I always suggest that in a presentation, people leave about half of the time that they have available for Q&A.
Oh, interesting. Half the time.
Half the time, yes.
Wow.
Half the time.
And do generally people have enough questions to fill that up, or is that kind of the point? You want it to be a dialogue.
Well, I try to make it a dialogue, and so if I'm presenting, I will let people know up front that I welcome questions anytime throughout my presentation, that I'm not necessarily going to have an official Q&A session at the end of my presentation, and that they should feel to interrupt me at any point if they have a question. If I don't do this, then what happens is if somebody has a question and I don't answer it, or I tell them to hold it or put it in the parking lot, then the only thing that that person is thinking about for the rest of my presentation is the question that they have. So encouraging questions throughout the presentation and letting people know that there's plenty of time for questions, that usually will get people to ask questions. And you know, it's very rare that when I'm presenting there's dead silence at the end. Usually we've established enough of a relationship to have a back and forth dialogue.
Oh, okay, great. But like you said, it's not like you leave the last half for questions. Is that you anticipate and you skim your content down to allow for a lot of questions and dialogue and answers?
Yes, absolutely. I think for a lot of people, they feel a lot of pressure when they're presenting, that they have to include every piece of information that's in their head. And one thing I say is there's no such thing as a perfect presentation. It doesn't exist. Same way there's no such thing as a perfect flavor of ice cream or a perfect song or a perfect movie. All you have to do is be good, and you have to be engaging. And then anything that you've missed, well, that's why you have plenty of time for questions, is to allow your audience to get clarity on specific things that you may not have addressed during the presentation.
I love that. Okay, so in our last minute or so, are there any mistakes? And I think we talked about that throughout, but is there anything else you can think of that you've seen people do in structuring? I mean, do they not preface all this? Do they not vocalize all this? Any other mistakes or common things that people do when they're trying to follow this format and structure?
Yeah, one other tip that I have is don't overwhelm people with data. Facts and figures are very important, especially when we're talking about things related to financial matters or technical information. And so what I always suggest is that if you have to use a fact or a figure or a piece of data, wrap it inside a story. Give it some context, give it some flavor. Don't just say that I'm going to increase sales by 300%. Tell us how. Tell us what goes into the process, because then people will remember the data and they have some context, and it makes you sound more credible and more believable.
Oh, I can see how people just put data up and they leave it at that. They let the data try to speak for itself.
Yes.
Okay. Awesome.
So,
Well, oh, please?
yeah, what we say is that data tells and stories sell.
Yep, I love that. I think I've heard that before somewhere. I love it. So this was really interesting. I've never thought about doing a lot of the stuff you recommend, but it makes complete sense. So thank you. I would love for you to share with people again what you do and how you can help them. We're B2B marketers, and I think everybody needs to hear this information. I just think marketers are always trying to, whether it's our customers or our prospects or our peers, our bosses, anyone. I would love to hear more about how you help people like us and where we can find you.
Well, you can find me at pitchandpresent.com, or you can get in touch with me through a company called SpeechWorks that's based here in Atlanta. And we do presentation skills training, media training, and sales skills. And so whatever type of presentation you have to give, whether it's a formal presentation in front of a large audience or an informal presentation that's done while sitting at a desk, anytime you have to convey information to an audience, you're presenting. And so everything that I teach in terms of structure, in terms of style, is applicable no matter what the presentation setting is.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much again, Marc. This was a lot of fun. I so appreciate you joining us today.
You're very welcome. I hope I was helpful.
Absolutely. And thank you, everybody, for watching. Don't forget, BMA Atlanta is our Twitter handle, and bmaatlanta.org is our website. All right, Marc and everybody, thank you very much. Take care.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.